Afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Young-Martin, and I serve as the Community Investments Manager for the Women's Fund of Western Massachusetts. Welcome to today's Wait What conversation on the shifting climate of the women's workforce in Western Massachusetts. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. Celebrating 25 years, the Women's Fund of Western Massachusetts has provided community investments in the form of grants, capacity building workshops, hosting convenings like this around specific topics, and uplifting women and girls serving organizations around strategic priorities, including economic security, addressing parity in positions of power and leadership, and freedom from gender-based violence, harm, and harassment. Our Wait What series allows us to further engage members of our community on how these issues directly impact those we serve and to provide resources on how to best address these disparities. Before we get started, we wanted to take this moment to give a special thank you to our underwriters, the Jamrog Group, Institute for Generative Leadership, and People's Bank for their continued support of women and girls in Western Mass. It is because of their generous support that programs such as our Wait What series are provided complimentary to our community. Over the past few months, several key reports were shared, including the impacts of COVID-19, a survey of Massachusetts households, and the 2022 Women's Leadership Impact Study produced by the Commonwealth Institute. While these reports, which the impacts of COVID-19 was co-authored by someone that we have on the panel today, while these reports provide formative and rich information, a large portion of the findings seem more relevant to communities based in Eastern Mass, though each are statewide studies. Given the wealth of information and important topics each of these reports raise, we wanted to convene to discuss the what and how for Western Massachusetts, especially how they speak to the need for organizations to shift practices and leadership to better represent the communities they serve and their needs. Today's conversation will feature Michelle Gonsalves, founder and executive director of University of Massachusetts Amherst's Women into Leadership program as moderator, and panelist Tanisha Arena, executive director of Arise for Social Justice and a member of the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women, Laura Sylvester, public policy manager for the Food Bank of Western Massachusetts and vice chair of the Hampshire Franklin Commission on the Status of Women and Girls, and Dr. Rta Advancement, assistant professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Dr. Viccarelli worked directly on the impacts of COVID-19 report, and which received some support from the Women's Fund of Western Massachusetts. We will first begin the discussion with Rta sharing some key findings from her report, which will serve as the foundation for today's discussion. Afterwards, we will turn it over to Michelle, who will moderate the discussion with Rta, Laura, and Tanisha. At the end of our discussion, we will open it up to respond to questions from our viewers. For those who are joining us via Zoom, if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free at any time during our session to post those questions in the Q&A, and we will address them at the appropriate time. So thank you all so much for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to Rta.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to share my screen so I can share a few slides with graphics with you. Slides good? Okay. So I'm going to give you some insights, like a glance to some of the most relevant results in relation to this seminar. The most relevant result of the report on impacts of COVID-19 that we have developed at the University of Massachusetts. This was a study based on a survey disseminated between October 2020 and February 2021. I should mention that this is part of a larger, broader national study that is going to be published very soon, and you will be able to find it on the webpage of the School of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Just a quick slide to acknowledge the members of the research team, mostly from UMass, but I would like to highlight that we also had a participation from the Indiana University and from Amherst College. And I would also like to mention that this study was possible thanks to the support in disseminating the survey and in promoting also the study, thanks to the support of the Women's Fund of Western Massachusetts, the Boston Women's Fund, the Food Bank of Western Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts Municipal Association. So thank you to our partners. More broadly, we had many more partners, and this is just a slide to acknowledge the huge effort that went into the dissemination of the survey, and we're very grateful to all our partners. So the research question in the study was, what are the challenges that households have been facing due to COVID-19, the public health crisis, but also the socioeconomic fallout, and what are the strategies that households are adopting to address these challenges. The report includes multiple sections, and today I will describe the key findings from one of the sections. But there are multiple sections in the report, and I mentioned them in case you're curious, from employment to business, household, financial health. We are going to look at the impacts on professional life and labor productivity, education and childcare, physical and mental health, substance use, food security, and then a glimpse to the preferred policy instruments and solutions across different socioeconomic groups. These are all very interconnected elements. And so I encourage you to give a look to the report because it will give you a broader picture. So the question that we asked was, how have COVID-19 disruptions affected your professional life? And in this graphic, you're going to see the answers from female respondents and male respondents. And the options available for this question were, I kept my job, but I became less productive. I kept my job, but I'm working fewer hours. I've lost my job. I took an unpaid leave. I left my job. I changed my job. I started a new job to financially support my family. What we're observing from these results is that male respondents are more likely to indicate that they kept their job, but they became less productive. But women are more likely to say that they actually took deliberate steps to change the path of their professional life for some reason. So they kept their job, or they took an unpaid leave. They kept the job, but they're working fewer hours, so they also have probably a lower remuneration. They took an unpaid leave, they left their job completely, or they changed profession. This is something that we wanted to investigate a little bit more, and we also wanted to understand the causes and the implications. In terms of implications, something that emerged very clearly is that women were more likely to become financially dependent on their partner due to COVID-19 disruptions. And they told us so. We asked this question, and 25% of female respondents said that that was the case for them, compared to 13% of male respondents. We tried to understand the causes of this. And obviously, one of the first reasons we can think of is household responsibilities and childcare. And so we asked, how much do you think COVID-19 childcare and education disruptions have been affecting your work productivity? And in this graph, you have on the left-hand side, the ages of children, and the color represents the level of intensity of the impact. Dark colors means strong impact, affected a lot versus not affected at all for the light teal color. And what you see here is that childcare disruptions had a strong impact, and particularly in the age group elementary school and below. And then, just to have a fuller picture, and we're almost at the end of this little overview, we try to understand what happened in the household. Of course, there is a huge new responsibility, which is taking care of children during regular work hours. But what happens in the households in terms of the distribution of responsibilities? So the question was, who between you and your partner spends more time performing the following activities? The following activities are managing children's schedule, supervising remote learning and other educational related activities, physical care for children, household activities, playing, doing activities with children. And here you see the answers for female respondents and male respondents. The dark color corresponds to I do more, and the lighter color corresponds to my partner does more. The middle color is we split work equally. And what you can see just chromatically is that women are associated more likely with the answer, I do more. So the conclusion is that there is an unequal distribution of the burden of responsibilities, and this burden might have been exacerbated during COVID, childcare and education disruptions, particularly when you look at supervising remote learning and other educational activities. This is disproportionately on the female side of the graph. We investigated whether this difference persists across couples comparing same-sex and heterosexual couples. The literature tells us that same-sex couples are more likely to split responsibilities more equally. Our sample is extremely small for same-sex couples, but we just tested it qualitatively, and the answers are in line with the literature. So same-sex couples seem to split responsibilities more equally. Just one last consideration. We asked, if COVID-19 disruptions persist, how will they affect your professional life and the professional life of your partner? And we asked female respondents with male partners. Sorry, we asked everybody, but this graph is only for that group because we had a small sample size for other subgroups. So just to have a glimpse to this type of outcomes. On the left-hand side, we have the respondent, and on the right-hand side, you have what the respondent thinks might happen to their partner. So the partner is a male. And what you see is that this reflects what is already going on. So this is what they expect in the future. And what they expect in the future is that there is going to be a reduction in productivity for their partners, but the changes in career are all going to be, are more likely to be on the female side, essentially. So keeping job but working fewer hours, taking an unpaid leave, changing job, or stop working. There are more things that I could tell you, and there is actually one element that I wanted to mention, which is physical and mental health. In our study, we were able to capture an indicator for depression and anxiety symptoms. We built this indicator in the survey with the support of a social worker from Indiana University. And this indicator is called the PHQ-4. And it's an indicator that measures the level of anxiety and depression in respondents. And what we found was that, female respondents, you see female, male, and other genders, female respondents were more likely to report severe, moderate, and mild depression and anxiety symptoms. And we also found that they were more likely, 30% of female respondents, to report having experienced a panic attack in the past 4 weeks. And I will wrap things up here, but I would like to also mention that this indicator of depression and anxiety is very strongly correlated with the inversely correlated with income, meaning we find higher anxiety and depression symptoms as income decreases. So there are multiple socioeconomic, gender, and household labor distribution factors that are interconnected in analyzing the outcomes of the COVID disruptions in relation to women in itself and women in relation to the workforce. Thank you.
I think we'll just jump into the questions now. So thinking about the shifting climate that Marta just described, as well as the already existing disparities that women in our communities have been facing, I would love for our panelists to just share their thoughts on how COVID has been a catalyst to change in organizational structures, to the ways in which we work, and even how we cultivate leadership. Is there someone that'd like to take that one first? Tanisha, how about you? I'll call on folks.
Oh my gosh, I've been voluntold. That's my term. COVID has been a catalyst in a number of ways. So like I heard you say, you know, the ways that we look at leadership. It's like, well, leadership had to look really different because we were navigating through something that I know I had said they didn't teach me this in grad school, how to run your organization through a pandemic. So it required thinking outside of the box and also knowing like, I'm affected too. My organization, the people that work at the organization, we didn't get a pass because we're doing this work, and COVID's like, oh no, you're fine. We're just gonna, that didn't happen. And so, and thinking about the requirements and the shifts, like this catalyst, it forced us to have to come up with new ways of existing and being, of doing this work, and not in the ways that we'd always done it, but able to reach people in the same ways, right? Meeting people where they're at. And it's like, well, I'm exactly where you are, because again, I'm not exempt from experiencing COVID and what that looks like. So we had to consider modifications to the building for access and considering accessibility things, right? Like if you have a model, we're dealing with folks who are experiencing homelessness. I can't just say, oh, call the office and make an appointment, or go online and make an appointment. I needed people to be able to walk in. So that looked like changing the building so that folks could actually walk in. We took a door and cut it into a Dutch door and put some plexiglass, and it's like put some of the most commonly used and asked for forms in that foyer area. But you could come in and see someone through the glass and kind of get triaged, and then make an appointment with someone face to face, and then come in and maintain appropriate social distancing. So it was a catalyst for radical change. Like, we're having this radical experience, and how do we meet people where they're at? And that's just one of the ways. Even when our office was closed, we were still going out to where people were to be able to address food instability issues that had come up. So that catalyst looked like we're doing some new stuff and trying to achieve the outcomes of helping people.
Thank you. What about some of our other panelists? How COVID has been a catalyst to change just our organizational structures, like Tanisha was saying, but the ways in which we work and how we cultivate leadership?
So I can jump in. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. So similarly to what Tanisha was saying, at the food bank, we had to make some pretty radical changes to how we do work. But I'll just say that more broadly, in relation to what Marta was saying, that women were already suffering higher rates of poverty in Western Mass than men. And so the pandemic has exacerbated that. And in addition, women are more likely to be in the types of jobs where they have a higher exposure to COVID due to work with the public or working in other types of environments. So they had a harder time avoiding avoiding COVID and being able to stay healthy. They were also more likely to be forced out of the paid workforce. And the lack of childcare, I think, was a huge component, with kids unable to be in school as normal or in daycare. Women, as Marta showed the data, the burden fell on women to be staying home and taking care of the children. So there's also the difference between work that could be done remotely and work that could be done on site. So I'll just talk about the Food Bank of Western Massachusetts. We are a food distribution site. We have 173 member agencies that we distribute food to. And then we have an office. So anybody who worked in food ops in our warehouse was required to be on site throughout the pandemic, whereas anybody who worked in the office has been working remotely. So right there you have a disparity. People who were able to work remotely had more advantage of being able to avoid illness than people who are not able to. In addition, our member agencies had to really change the way that they distribute food. A lot of them were choice pantries, which means that people could just go in and choose whatever kind of food that they want. And that had to change because people could no longer go into pantries. So the model moved to be outdoor pickup, which meant that bags had to be pre-packed. So people lost the ability to choose what they wanted. So I'll just stop there, and I'll let somebody else address this as well.
So I would like to second what Laura said in terms of the type of jobs may be also different, and that may have an impact in the professional choices of women. We found in our survey that respondents who are not white are more likely to be essential workers in our survey. And we adopted the question related to race and ethnicity that we have also in the census. And so besides asking the race, we asked for ethnicity in relation to being Latino or not. And we found that independently from race, being Latino increases the likelihood of being an essential worker. So the impacts that we see on families, on women's careers, but on families at large, including the effects on childcare and education and the attention received by children, may be different depending on the professions of their parents. And the professional choices of their parents may be different depending on the type of jobs that they have. So if a parent is an essential worker and suddenly their kids are at home, they might need to just take an unpaid leave or leave their position because they're not going to be able to supervise, say, a kindergartner in remote learning if the child has to be in remote learning. So for somebody who's able to work remotely, that is a huge burden because they're not going to be able to focus on their job full time from home, but they're going to be next to the kid anyways. But for a parent who's supposed to be physically somewhere else, that implies a complete shift in their professional choices. And this, in terms of percentage of essential workers in our survey, it seems that this is more likely to be on minorities. So these are considerations that we made as a research team when we were going through the data. And then when we think about women in general, it seems that the labor distribution in the household is a default factor that then affects all our professional choices. Because if mothers, if the women are more likely to be responsible for all those childcare and home responsibilities that we listed before in my little presentation, then it's obvious that if these responsibilities get amplified because of a remote learning setting, the women in the family are more likely to have to bear that responsibility. And that is going to affect their professional choices, sometimes deliberately. So it's not that they're going to be necessarily sidelined by their employers in tasks, projects, or responsibilities, but they may actually make the decision to take a step to the side. And this is an unfair distribution of responsibilities socially. So when I think about triggers and how COVID might have accelerated certain processes, maybe temporarily or maybe not, but in some cases irreversibly for some groups because they cannot go back to their job. So when I think about that, I realize, we realized as a research team that the infrastructure that we have for childcare and education is indispensable to allow women to have an active role in the workforce. And when that service disappears, then there is no possible equality in access to different professional paths.
Thank you. And thinking about some of these external forces that are really impacting the decisions that women can make, I'm also thinking about the cliff effect. And so I wonder if you all could speak about efforts that organizations or employers can or maybe are taking to address additional disparities created by things like the cliff effect, when a change in pay can change the benefits that you receive as well.
So I can start by talking about this. So let's first just define what the cliff effect is, because not everybody knows what it is. Certainly if you've experienced it, you know, but it's a bit of a wonky term that needs a little bit of an explanation. So the cliff effect happens when somebody who's working but doesn't earn enough to fully support themselves is eligible for certain state and federal benefits. So whether it's a childcare subsidy, a housing subsidy, a transportation subsidy, or SNAP benefits, they get that in addition to the money that they earn. So if they take a new job or they get a raise that gives them a small increase in income, that can put them over the threshold for the benefits that they're able to receive. So they may lose their SNAP, they may lose their housing, they may lose their childcare, but the amount of benefits lost is far greater than the small amount extra they're earning. So they actually end up being worse off than they were before. So this is a huge problem that disproportionately affects women and especially single moms. And so it can perpetuate poverty for generations. It can keep people from being able to advance in a career. And it's a huge problem. So one thing that employers and organizations can do, if we're being honest, is to pay a living wage. Because even though in Massachusetts, we are lucky that we have raised our minimum wage. Right now it's $14.25 an hour, and it's going up next year to $15 an hour, which is double what some states. There are many states that are still around the $7 or $8 an hour minimum wage is. So we're better off, but our cost of living is so high that $15 an hour is still nowhere near a living wage. So there's an MIT calculator that you can look up online that tells you what the living wage is for any given area. In Hampden County, MIT just raised the amount for a single parent with 2 children living in Hampden County needs to be earning $49.55 an hour, or $99,000 a year, in order to make ends meet. That is a lot of money. How many people in Hampden County actually make that much money? I don't think very many. So since it's unrealistic to expect that employers are going to be able to pay that much, I think the next best thing that we can do is to make sure that the benefits systems are working to protect families against these cliff effects. Employers need to be aware of the cliffs and help workers offset them. And they can do that by offering flexibility in hours. They can offer on-site childcare, financial coaching, transportation subsidies, things like that. And that's just a start. But I think we have a long way to go.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to tackle that question?
I feel like I do, but I see it on the back end, like about the cliff effect will be folks coming into the Arise office because they're navigating through things like this, where it's like, okay, I decided to better myself and, you know, take some courses, and now I'm making more money and I'm losing my SNAP benefits, and I'm not necessarily making enough money to be able to afford all of the things, right? As she's given us the numbers, right? You have to make $100,000 to make ends meet in Hampden County. And how many folks are actually making 100 grand and making ends meet in Hampden County? And I'm also navigating in a space where there's the bigger picture of things and the pieces that go together. So if we keep with the, you know, I lost my SNAP, maybe there's the person who kept their SNAP, but with fuel prices being what they are, that's translated into increased costs at the grocery store. So maybe they were making it almost to the end of the month with what they had, and now half, because they can buy a heck of a lot less with the same dollars, because that pack of chicken wings that was $6 is now 13. And I think those are real numbers, and just what that looks like. You know, we talk about affordable housing. I decided to get a better job, so now, you know, my rent subsidy has changed, or even what is affordable housing into who? Or if I show up, I have to make 3 times the rent to be in this space, even if I've already lived in this space. And these are actual examples about Springfield, you know, where property, you know, is bought and sold, and the new property managers say, hey, these are rules. It's like, but I've lived here for like 10 years. And now you're telling me I can't afford to live in a place where I've lived. You know, these are some of the effects of COVID, and like, what can you do as an employer is one thing. But then when you're caught up in the systems and institutions as they are, how are we navigating through that? Because like, you can offer financial coaching, but you can't financial literacy your way out of poverty. And naming and knowing that, it's like, okay, if I don't make 100 grand, there's no amount of financial literacy you can give me that's going to help make my ends meet. I need those resources to make my ends meet. So I want us to be mindful and think about things like that. And again, COVID was like, hey, look, all the things that you said you couldn't do, you didn't see, do you see them now? Because we didn't have a choice. It's glaringly obvious, like in our processes, procedures, the way that we claim we had to do business. And that's again with these agencies that are offering these kind of supports. No, you have to physically come down here. You're missing this piece of paperwork. You got to leave and come back. And with COVID, it was like, oh, wait, the office is closed, but we're still working. So you can accept electronic copies. Wow, look at that. Or you can, as a funder, you know, do a direct deposit to get these programs running, or you can email me a check and I can print it and cut it and take it to the bank. those things are also important. And I think language matters when we talk about essential workers. Were they essential or sacrificial? Because the data that Martha pointed out, like who was doing those jobs and do we value them? Because if you're so essential and I value you, why am I not putting my money there? We fund what we value.
Thank you. I want to make sure that we pull the conversation into Western Massachusetts. So I know we're talking about the cost of living in Hampden County, for instance, and I want to keep pushing in that direction. So what really sparks today's Wait What is those 3 reports that Nicole mentioned at the beginning of our hour. And the reports offered really great insight for the entire state of Massachusetts, but most of the information was really relevant to Greater Boston or Worcester, which is unfortunately like how most statewide studies end up being. So I'm wondering if you all could touch upon what in particular women in Western Massachusetts need as we think about this shifting climate of the workforce for women.
So I have a couple of observations. In our report, we were able to disaggregate data by level of rurality. There is a definition of rurality offered by the government of Massachusetts. And so we were able to compare answers in urban level, in urban environments, suburban environments, rural level 1 and rural level 2 in terms of how marginalized or how far from urban centers a community is. And we found different needs in different locations. And something that I wanted to bring up, which is also connected to what Tanisha was saying in terms of digitalization or being able to perform certain tasks digitally, is that there was a big barrier that emerged in the survey associated to access to the internet and technology in rural areas. So if we imagine a possibility where women in rural areas are able to maintain their job by working remotely, but in that scenario, there is not the technology to support them, then automatically there is a roadblock in terms of staying connected digitally and metaphorically to their job. So this was an element that I wanted to bring up today because we realized that it was a big barrier for respondents, not only in terms of their participation at work, but also in terms of their children's education. They didn't have enough resources for a strong enough internet connection, or even if they had the resources, the internet connection was just not supportive enough for their community, or not available, or very unreliable. So this is something to think about in terms of infrastructure to give people, women working in Western Massachusetts, a fair chance to stay connected professionally.
Yeah, I would say similarly to the lack of internet access is lack of reliable transportation. There's huge gaps in transportation in Western Mass. There's rural areas where there are no options whatsoever. And even in the urban areas that are served by transportation, the routes are often not enough. They don't connect with one another in a timely way. It can take hours to go, 10 miles. And so better funding for public transportation is something that we've been trying to organize at the Food Bank. We lead a Western Mass Transportation Advocacy Network that is a group of planners and RTAs and legislators and advocates and transportation users who are in 4 counties of Western Mass, and we meet monthly, and we work to leverage our voice so that we are heard in Boston when it comes to funding. And we've been working on a number of things. And one is there's an RTA Advancement Bill that Natalie Blay, Rep. Blay, is one of the co-sponsors of, that would provide equitable funding for the regional transit authorities, which are the ones that run the bus routes throughout the state. But in Western Mass in particular, we really need more funding for that. So I think if people were able to use public transportation to get to work in a timely way, or even to just get to grocery stores and other places, medical appointments, that would be hugely helpful. And then I think that the third big piece is childcare. Childcare options are already challenging, and that was made so much worse by COVID. Many childcare centers closed. And I don't have the statistics exactly, but I know that is a huge struggle for women. And we really need more subsidized childcare, and we need more options for people to bring their children to.
If I may, just a corollary to everything that Laura said, besides the barrier, the technological barrier, the lack of access to the internet or technology, something else that emerged in relation to transportation is access to healthcare. And during COVID, many respondents indicated in rural areas, indicated difficulties in getting care, essentially. And this was particularly exacerbated for older respondents, but it was a generalized problem in relation to rural areas. So I wanted just to bring it up because it's an important component and a basic need that seem to be challenging.
Thank you. Tanisha, were you going to say something as well?
Yeah, I had written down a few things which Laura and Marta had talked about. So the childcare, free or affordable, that's a barrier. The technology with the internet and having it be fast enough. I also wrote down on here mental health, because there are the disparate other impacts. Like, yes, we're talking about COVID and its effects on the community, but the community was already having effects that just got amplified. And we've got to look at, again, at the systemic and institutional level, if we're going to say that racism is a public health crisis, COVID amplified that. It's like we're now at the intersection of COVID and capitalism. That has an effect, and of course, on your mental health, right? If we're, navigating in spaces as women, Black women, women of color, there's a pathology. There's something that happens to you when you're trying to contort yourself in a system of white supremacy and racism. And that is inherent in the experiences of COVID and these disparities in the way that they show up for women, because there's patriarchy, and the way that they show up for Black and brown women, and there's the racism piece. And so certainly having adequate mental health resources would ease some of this, because when you're trying to navigate being in this system, that's one thing. Oh, and I have housing instability and food insecurity, and I don't have adequate childcare. Oh, but I need to get a job, but I don't have childcare, and there's not adequate transportation. It's just compounded. And the thing that's going to be at the bottom is your mental health. So having space for that and naming it and inserting it here is certainly an important piece of the conversation as well, about the impact on, women and COVID, with like this pandemic and what it has done in Western Mass.
Thank you. I think that the compounding comment is such an important one, because you don't experience these things in isolation. And there are obviously very many needs for women in Western Massachusetts. I think I will offer one more question, and we'll turn to questions from the audience. So if folks have anything, they can put them in the chat. I think folks are monitoring on Facebook Live as well. But my last question, we'll continue on this conversation. And what are your organizations doing for women in the workforce, particularly around the topics we've discussed today? What type of policy work is your organization addressing that pertains to these issues? And I hope all our panelists would be able to speak to that. Laura?
So I can start this one off. So we have a bill that we're working to pass, a piece of legislation. It's got a big, long, wonky name. It's called an Act Concerning Public Assistance for Working Families and the Creation of a Pilot Program to Address the Impacts of the Cliff Effect. The numbers for it are S119 and H208. I can put the link in the chat later. It's a legislation that's sponsored by Senator Eric Lesser and then Reps Pat Duffy and Carlos Gonzalez. And what it would do is it would create a pilot program for 100 families to enter into a 3-year training program to give them training along a real career path. So whether it's something in IT or in healthcare, and it would use the Massachusetts Earned Income Tax Credit to pay them the loss of any benefits that were incurred because they're earning more money. So you have when I described the cliff effect earlier, people take a job that gives them a little bit more money and they lose their housing, their transportation, their childcare benefits. They end up worse off than before. This would solve that problem by using the earned income tax credit to plug the gap, and so that they would never be worse off than they were before, and that they would be able to then take this training, take a new job, and really get in a career path that would allow them to be self-sufficient. So we are really excited about this bill. It also comes with coaching, skills training, advancement opportunities, financial counseling. And then at the end of the 3-year program, there's a savings component. So if you successfully complete the 3-year training, you get up to $10,000 in cash. That is no strings attached. You can use that money for whatever you want. If this pilot is successful, it can easily be scaled up for the rest of the state. We're already partnering with workforce development, with employers, community action coalitions, and more. I have been working really closely with Ann Candilis, who runs Springfield Works. And so the main components of this program are already in place. And then the legislation would just add the earned income tax credit to have the financial component. So, we're really optimistic. This is actually the 3rd session that this bill has been introduced. In Massachusetts, we have a 2-year legislative session, and the average time it takes for a bill to pass is 6 years or 3 sessions. And so we are now at the end of the 3rd session. So we're hoping we're going to slide in there on that average. And then the really great thing about this legislation, it actually saves the state money, because it costs more money for the state to pay the amount of benefits than it does to pay the amount of benefits lost. So if a family isn't working and the state has to support them with full benefits, that costs much more than if the state is supporting them to get out of poverty and be able to be self-sufficient. So I'm happy to share more about that. We have an Economic Pathways Coalition that Ann Candilis and I have started. It's a statewide coalition, and we are always welcoming more people to join. And the way to join that is just to email me. I can also share my email. We meet monthly, and we have a lot of good programs that we're already doing. There's a lot of peer support. There's a lot of coaching support. And I can go into more detail later, but I'll let other people talk now.
Marta or Tanisha, can you share what your organizations are doing for women in the workforce, or address on what they're doing on any of the topics that we've touched on today?
Sure. Well, Arise is currently partnered with the Women's Fund on the Greater Springfield Women's Economic Security Hub. And so in partnership with Dress for Success, Western Mass, Springfield Works, and Western New England University School of Law, Social Justice Center. And we're going to actually interview women to see what their experiences have been. And that data will be tabulated and quantified, and to see exactly what has happened, like in real time. And that's, I feel like, an important piece, in addition to addressing who comes into the door anyway with the things that they're experiencing. Folks come in now. I have food insecurity. We have a full service food pantry, which was one of the pivots that we made during, COVID. And I hate to say during COVID because it's still here. And I think it's important to actually name that. And again, like, who primarily shows up in Arise? It's women and children. Who experiences the highest rates of poverty? Women and children. And Black and brown women and children experience that entirely different. And so addressing what that looks like in our community, and meeting people where they're at, and doing the things of, if you need emergency shelter placement, we're taking care of that, and the food needs, and we have, clothing donation rooms. So if you need to have those basic needs, and toiletries, and just what's happening on the ground. Transportation, we have stipends for that. If you need, Uber, Lyft, you're going to take the bus to go to one of these other organizations, and even advocating for the placement of these organizations. Like when they move the DTA office way over to Cottage Street in an industrial area, not exactly on the bus line, so how are people able to access help and what that looks like? So we're pushing for those kinds of changes. And, you know, even if it's not pushing for the change, it's bringing awareness to the issue so that, you know, more folks can become engaged and say, hey, why is this looking this way? You know, because I think that that's a part of it too. Like, instead of just trying to put Band-Aids on why it looks this way and helping people navigate through it, let's tear down the things that don't work and are harming people, but are supposed to be helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you. So my contribution to this question is I'm a university professor. So what I do is professionally is collecting data, analyzing data, and trying to provide information to those who can take action. So I can contribute to actionable science. And not just me, but my research team and my colleagues and the students of the School of Public Policy were involved in this project. And in fact, this project started as a class. And it was a class where the Women's Fund was our partner in answering a question. So then COVID happened and we spun the project and we started investigating the effects of the pandemic on households, with a special focus on minorities, women, and children and youth. So what I would like to say with this is that our work in relation to this specific project showed that there are already strong impacts on women. I haven't showed you, but there is a large segment of our analysis devoted to children. And we do know that every time there is a socioeconomic impact on women, that has reverberations on children, and that can have reverberations in a long time frame in terms of generational irreversible impacts on those children. And so we really hope that the results of our analysis will be useful for policymakers, and we are already thankful to the Women's Fund, because this is a platform where we can actually share these results. So thank you so much for inviting us and letting us share these results. But as an addendum, I would like to say that the School of Public Policy has every year classes where we work with external organizations. We work with the Women's Fund, we have worked with the United Nations and several other NGOs and intergovernmental organizations. So we're always eager to collaborate with partners outside of academia to promote positive change. So that's what we can do for you.
Perfect. Thank you so much to Michelle, Marta, Laura, and Tanisha for presenting and talking about some very important information today. I just want to open up the floor to make sure people who are joining us today have an opportunity to pose any questions that they may have. Those who are joining us via Zoom, you can either post those questions in the Q&A or chat prior to us wrapping up today. I actually want to pose one question to Michelle, given that she works on a university program. What are some topics that the students who participate in Women into Leadership have been engaging with? And I do know some of them do end up going on to graduate school in public policy.
Yes, many of them do. We are a program that focuses on public service in general, so public policy is definitely somewhere that they go, and public health. It's a range of programs, but our programming this year, there's been a lot of excitement around civil discourse, because we have students who want to advocate for change and make change, like all the women today are talking about. But it can be a scary place to raise your voice nowadays when having a civil conversation is difficult. Politics is a place where you're going to disagree, but you should be able to disagree and still move forward. So that's a lot of what we've been talking about. As I think about young women who will be taking on these leadership positions that we're talking about in the workforce, I think that they need the support of mentors throughout their career to take them along and show what the professions look like, so they can gain experience and explore and see models for effective advocacy and how they can make change on the topics that they care about.
Perfect, thank you. We do have one question that came in from the Q&A, and I love this question because it's how do we actively engage now? What can be done now? How do we support women in the workforce while we wait for legislation? And I know some of you are doing some very particular things, especially at Arise. Tanisha, can you touch upon the changes you made in terms of bringing on contracted workers into full-time staff? And I know that you do have a lot of women on staff at your organization.
I do. And then I think that's also a testament to like who does the work and what that looks like. And at the start of COVID and all the running around, like I inherited a staff that came, they were part-time, they were on 1099s. That was just the structure. And then everything shut down. And it was like, okay, so someone who's actually on payroll, they have protections, there's unemployment, and the board had decided that I would keep working. So I was getting paid, but my staff was having a really different experience as gig workers. And that didn't feel good. And it's like, we can't be an organization that's advocating for the rights of poor and low income folks and all these economic injustices and perpetuating economic injustice. So I sat with the board and said, we're going to change this. I don't care what it costs. There's never going to be a good time, because it's also about expenses. And that's how are we doing this work, right? In a capitalist society, the goal is to get the labor for as cheap as possible or for free. That might be another wait, what conversation. So it was, we got to do this. So everybody off of 1099 on payroll, and also bumped up to full-time. And was that a big lift? Yes, but it was also really important because when things like this happen, where are the protections? And who was disproportionately affected? My staff is 95% women. And so again, we can't perpetuate the very things that we say we're out here trying to eradicate, and it just made sense. And Arise didn't fall apart, the world didn't stop. And yes, everybody is paid a living wage, more than what a living, because that's changing. What exactly is a living wage? Like 100 grand in Western Massachusetts, but is that actually enough? Because when they did that, I bet the gas wasn't $5, $6 a gallon. So that's changing what a lot of these things look like. And what can we do to actively support while we're waiting for legislation? Do the things without waiting for the legislation. Because in an organization, I mean, the way that this is set up and structured, it's like, well, private companies can do whatever they want. So pay people, pay the women what they're worth. Whether you're in a nonprofit, whether you're at a higher education institution, pay people what they're worth. We can navigate around these things, right? The built-in barriers, we can do something about them in-house. And if you're in a position of power and you don't do that, you're abusing the power that you have. You're replicating the dominance and superiority that your organization is tasked with eradicating. We put our money where our values are.
Thank you so much. And then Laura, being that you were at the Hampshire Franklin County Commission on the Status of Women and Girls, are there any updates there in terms of what's going on?
Well, I mean, I think what Tanisha said was so beautifully put. And I would add that workers are starting to realize that they have power. You know, we're seeing a lot of union organizing that we haven't seen in many years. You know, this is more nationally, we talk about Amazon, Starbucks, but in Western Mass, there's a labor shortage. There are more jobs available than there are workers applying for that. And you know, part of the reason workers aren't applying for them is the fact of the lack of childcare and transportation, et cetera. But workers need to realize that they do have power. And so, you know, in addition to employers needing to pay workers more, workers need to demand more. And women need to demand more. So, you know, I think we're in a really unique opportunity now that COVID has really opened eyes to show that that essential workers are essential, that the disparities are horrendous and need to be addressed. And you know, I would really empower women, and especially younger women, to know that they do have this ability to raise their voice, to speak up. I would encourage everybody to register to vote and to get out and use that vote. And I would also really encourage women to run for office, because I think we need a lot more women in elected positions.
Thank you so much, Laura. And then also too, there was a question that came through, and I want to, and this is going to be our last question. And for those who register for this event, we're going to do a follow-up email with all of these resources listed. But if we needed access to data that better represented what is going on in Western Mass, all 4 counties, including Berkshire, Franklin, Hampshire, and Hampden, where would we find those, and who are authoring those reports?
So it seems that, just a note, it seems that the Women's Fund is collecting this data from the answer that I saw there, and that's great. I also look forward to seeing this report from the Women's Fund. In our report, we do not have a section that is specifically about Western Mass, but it's more on this gradient of urban to rural. But it's an interesting point that we could explore actually in our research. So this is something that I just wanted to put out there. If there is interest, reach out to us and we see what we can do with the data.
Perfect. And I also wanted to cite, oh, thank you, Michelle. Michelle put in the chat, pioneervalleydata.org's link. The Public Health Institute of Western Massachusetts, which I'll include their website shortly, has a lot of data on various things that are relevant to our area. And then also too, even though this is a couple of years old, I want to cite the Women's Fund's 2019 Status of Women and Girls report as well, which has some very relevant data. Even though it's pre-COVID, many of those numbers and disparities still exist. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up for this afternoon. I want to thank our panelists again, Michelle for moderating, Marta especially for uncovering many of the important data from the report, Laura and Tanisha for joining us today, and thank you to everyone joining us from Facebook and also from Zoom. So have a great afternoon, and make sure to follow us and online at mywomensfund.org for upcoming events. Thanks so much.